Okay, in this video, I'll talk about really how you can start as a beginner a new Shopify store or a new e-commerce store for that matter. Because actually most of my videos, right, in my channel generally is about how to improve your Shopify store if you already have one, right? If you already have made your first sales, if you already have a store, I really talk about all topics on how to improve it, right? From marketing to logistics to CRM to website optimization to content to revenue-based financing to general cash flow issues to automating everything, right? If you check out any of my previous videos, it's typically about how to improve a e-commerce store that already has a certain amount of traction. But in this video, I really want to talk how you can start as a beginner and generally the best way I would approach it if I had known everything I know now from, essentially having gone through all this experience of having operated several Shopify stores and having a portfolio of Shopify stores, how I would approach it if I would start a new store as a beginner. So check it out. So you're thinking of starting an e-commerce store, potentially on Shopify or somewhere else. Those are the most important things, in my opinion, that you should really focus on. Those are the things I know now that I wish I knew in the very beginning. So let's jump straight in. I have a nice slide for you, as per usual. All right, so to take a step back, right, I've mentioned this in some of my previous presentations, but there's 4 things that I would mention first, which are the 4 things that you need to essentially scale and build a business around your Shopify store, which is, not to be too obvious here, product market fit. You need to find the right product that essentially customers want and that there's a gap in the market for. You then need to create amazing content around this product. You then need to show it to the right people, so targeting. And finally, you need to convert those people on your website. If you do those 4 things in that order, you will make sales on your Shopify store. Now, this is easier said than done, right? And I totally get it, but I think it's important to set the stage that those are the 4 factors that you need to focus on. And to be honest, the most important factor, if you do one thing right, it is find the right product market fit for your Shopify store. In other words, choose the right product. Now that's also easier said than done. And I've actually mapped out how I believe, and this is also through a lot of empirical evidence, how product market fit correlates with the potential of your Shopify store or any e-commerce store for that matter. You can see that if you move right on the y-axis, so the product market fit is better, so the product is better that you're selling, then the revenue, the potential revenue of that store also increases on the y-axis. However, that relationship is not linear, it's exponential, meaning that the best products in tier 1, so you can see the ones that would be in the top right corner, are making exponentially more revenue than really poor products in the bottom left-hand side of this diagram. And there's many reasons for that, right? But I think what you have to understand is that you might test a few products, right? Like those red dots here, and they might just, and this just statistically is what's likely gonna happen, they might all fall into tier 4 and 3 and 2, meaning that just if you test those products on a new Shopify store, they will be below break-even ROAS. What does that mean? That means that if you're running ads on Facebook, Google, TikTok, or anywhere else, or spending marketing dollars anywhere to test it, right, you will make less revenue than your break-even cost basis, meaning that you're going to lose money. This is normal, and 99% or whatever of products would fall in those categories, especially in the beginning when you're learning and you don't know too much about a given niche or a given kind of product, or generally about how to run a Shopify store, right? And everyone starts here. It's very easy to essentially to essentially test a few products and just be kind of not unlucky, but statistically you're going to land in this kind of lower segment of the graph. You might get very lucky and already, land and get a profitable and revenue generating product. However, in my experience, the one way, or maybe the only way to truly overcome this is to test way more products, right? In a separate video, I really talk about testing in batches of 20 products at a time. Here you can see the green dots, which is not 20, but it's definitely more. The point is that the more products you test, the higher your chance is that you're going to land on a wider distribution of outcomes, and therefore increasing your chance of getting 1 or 2 products in that tier 1, tier 2 segment, meaning those products, right, for whatever reason, you have found a gap in the market, right? That there's enough demand for it. At the same time, it's not saturated enough, and there's enough defensibility around this product where you can generate revenue and even be profitable in the beginning to then start building a brand, start building a business around the Shopify store, right? And start improving all the other pillars around the Shopify store, right? So improving the logistics, the CRM, the content, the marketing funnels, the way you remarket your customers, all those things you can then start improving. But first you need to find that product, and the only way you find that product is by testing a lot of products, mapping out this distribution for yourself, which you'll also learn so much by doing this, right? So in and of itself, even if all the products fail, it'll be valuable because at least you'll see small differences between the products, right? Some that are break-even ROAS, some that are 0 ROAS, some that are 1.5 ROAS, but still not profitable. You'll see all those things, and you'll start getting a feel for what products work and what products don't. So I think this is point number one, right? That really focus on product market fit. This is worth your time and worth testing enough products. And I have a separate video on exactly how to test the products. All the criteria I look at, I literally have like an Excel sheet with more than 50 criteria that I check off one by one. So check it out. I'm not going to go into it here because it'll take too much time. But there is a very methodical, systematic way that you can go about this. Now, moving on, another point I want to really make is generic versus unique products. The most generic product you can choose is AliExpress type of product that, again, you can find, or that anyone with an internet connection can find on AliExpress or Alibaba, which has lower barriers to entry by definition, and it's relatively commoditized and also not very differentiated, meaning that everyone can go and essentially sell the same product, right? The supplier, will sell to anyone. There's no restrictions, and anyone can really do it. So if you move a bit more right on that spectrum towards unique, it is a generic product, but private label, right? So that's, I think, already the first kind of milestone in terms of making it a bit more unique, where the product itself might still be generic, but at least the name that you put onto the product will be your brand, right? It will be your name, and that will at least, make it slightly more unique in the sense that there might be still thousands or tens of thousands of other merchants selling the same product, but at least that name will be yours, and you can put it on the product, you can put it on the packaging, you can add a leaflet to it, right? It can also go towards you having a unique color. For example, you talk to your supplier and say, hey, can you create a very unique color of this product, or maybe a unique texture if that's applicable to your product. So hopefully you get the point that this is where you can already start differentiating yourself a little bit, although you're still towards, you're still a generic side of the spectrum. Then if we move more right, that's a product that you have already designed and customized, right? Generally, it might already be a product that exists, but you're adding onto it somehow. You're somehow customizing and personalizing it, maybe in a very small way, but at least if the customer gets that version of a product, you're the only store that can provide exactly that version, right? They can get similar products from a bunch of other competitors potentially, but specifically that version with that additional customization or personalization or whatever it is that you're adding onto that product is truly unique, even though the product itself might not be. And finally, if you go to the very right, that's the truly unique product that you kind of design yourself. You really kind of almost invent it, and it might go all the way to actually having patent protection. It's not necessarily necessary, but that's a truly unique product. In a separate video, I really talk about this spectrum in more detail, so also check it out. But two examples I give for unique products is SodaStream and AeroPress. Those are both in the beverages niches, and those are great e-commerce brands that have really invented, in the case of AeroPress, a new way to brew coffee, right, and kind of competing with the traditional mocha cups and French presses and espresso machines. And then also you have SodaStream, which, if you're not familiar, is like kind of this machine bottle that essentially allows you to create soda out of normal water. So those are great examples. Why am I mentioning this is because you have to decide where on the spectrum you want to be, right? And depending where you're on the spectrum, it correlates with very important things that you have to know when making this decision. Number one is your net profit margin potential, right? So the more unique the product is, the higher your potential of making a net profit margin, but the more difficult it is to start that type of store, right? So this is a trade-off, and you should be very clear about this trade-off when you're starting, right? You can go for a more unique product, but it's going to take more time, potentially more capital. It's going to take more banging your head against the wall, harder problems to solve, right? But because of that, you're going to have higher barriers to entry. You're therefore going to have more defensibility, a bigger moat. You're going to be able to build out your store and make revenue and profit longer and more sustainably at a higher margin, right? So that's the trade-off that generally exists, and that you have to decide on which side of the spectrum you want to be, and how, and just what also gears towards your strengths and weaknesses. And again, there's nothing wrong with starting with the generic side of the spectrum, but just, again, keep in mind that if it's generic, everyone can compete with you. And even if there are abnormal profits in the short term, it's just a matter of time until enough competition comes in and outcompetes those abnormal profits to zero, where then everyone is essentially making the minimal margin possible. And anyway, what happens is that some people start with generic and then they move right to spectrum, right? So it's very classic that people start drop shipping with a generic product, then they private label it, then they customize it at some point once the relationship with their supplier is good enough. And eventually they might be inspired to actually invent a similar product in that niche, which ultimately solves the problem better, faster, stronger, cheaper than the product that they were initially selling. And finally, competition, right? At the very bottom, you can see that, of course, the more unique your product is, right, the lower the competition, just because, again, the more difficult it is, by definition, it's also going to be more difficult for your competitors. But if you manage to succeed, and again, I'm comparing both sides of the spectrum kind of equally, that if you're successful with a unique or generic product, then those are the trade-offs that you should keep in mind. And I have a little decision tree, which again, linking to a previous video, right, is that, again, so you need to understand that product market fit is the most important and first decision you need to make, right? Then you need to understand the trade-offs of having a generic product versus a unique product. And then I have this decision tree where actually, in the very beginning, I even say, and this is a bit kind of outside of this video, is that you should also think, do you actually want to sell a physical product or a digital product? Let's stick with physical, because that's really what Shopify is mostly about, although I also talk about digital elsewhere. And again, we have a Shopify app, which is a digital product, so we're familiar with this too. But again, within physical, it then branches out into generic and unique. Given the trade-offs, given your strengths and weaknesses, you need to decide where you want to start, where you want to go. Then you really have to, in my opinion, I think what's also really important for you to decide is, do you want to sell a low ticket or a high ticket item? That means on your average order value, AOV, is it going to be high or low? We have across our stores really kind of everything under the sun, right? Where we've sold products that, again, are very low ticket, which I would say are like 20, 30 bucks an order on average, all the way to high ticket items that are, $200, $300 on average per item, or potentially even much, much more. So this is important because why I specifically chose to frame it like this is because actually your margin is way less under your control than I think you might assume in the beginning, right? There's a lot of external factors, competition, what happens on Facebook or Google when you're launching ads, the ROAS, the fluctuations in terms of all kinds of things. But what you can truly control, right, is how much you sell your product for and what the product is ultimately. If it's just a more luxury, high-end type of product, it's going to come with a high ticket price. And that, I think, is generally better because you can potentially have higher margins and essentially have way more room to play around with financially to build a business around it. Finally, within the high ticket option, let's just assume you go with that, you can do a one-off purchase type of product or a subscription-based product, right? So that's kind of where this decision tree ends. To keep it relatively simple, I think you should make a decision based on this. For example, maybe use this as a framework to just kind of test some of the thoughts you already had. And in my opinion, the more right you are, again, the more on that spectrum you're going to be in terms of unique, harder, more of a pain to create and do and run, but the payoffs will potentially also be much higher, right? So lower competition, higher barriers to entry, leading to lower competition, higher net profit, higher revenue, longer sustainable, defensible moat of an e-commerce store that you can potentially build. Okay, so we've discussed product market fit, and now going back to this slide, I want to really talk about content and the creative for your e-commerce store, which I think is the second very important factor. And again, I actually have a separate video where I just talk about all those factors and those graphs in great detail. I know it might seem a bit theoretical. It does really translate into practice, and I've definitely lived that, but let's really talk about the quality of the content that you then have for your Shopify store. Again, on the x-axis, I think that's how it correlates, at least in my experience. On the x-axis is the quality of your content, so from low to high. and how this correlates with the potential revenue of a given Shopify store on the y-axis, as you can see. What's interesting about this graph is that I think there's a lot of content which is very middle of the pack, so tier 2 in this case, where you essentially get some sort of attention, but it's generally, let's say, quote unquote, relatively generic content about the product, right? Even if your product is great, you will, with a generic, if your product is great, with a generic piece of content, you will generate some revenue, right? If you show the product, right? If you, make a video explaining how the product works and highlighting certain features, kind of the usual stuff, you will make some sort of revenue. And I think a lot of pieces of content land on this line somewhere here in the middle. However, we all know there are viral videos out there, also for e-commerce stores, and that's really in this tier 1, right, which I call the virality factor. So this goes beyond just, again, generic maybe here isn't the right word, but beyond normal piece of content which most e-commerce stores have, right, just about the product, explaining how it works, highlighting certain features. This has an interesting spin to it, a different angle, whatever it is. Again, obviously virality is a huge topic and so many things go into it, right? But what's clear is that it is possible to create content which is viral about the exact same product where other pieces of content are not, meaning that there's a difference between, let's say, most of the pieces of content the store creates, making 2, 3, 4 ROAS, right? Return on ad spend on those, let's just stick with paid marketing channels, versus a piece of content which doesn't make a 3 ROAS, but a 30 ROAS, right? And it might be an outlier in that sense, but obviously you want to find those outliers. And you should, because the great thing about content is you have as many at-bats as you want, or as much time, as you're willing to invest into it, in the sense that you can keep on pumping new content and keep on trying, right? And not only is it that a viral piece of content can give you a 30 ROAS instead of a 3 ROAS because it's an outlier, but it can even go viral organically, right? Which is essentially for free if you do it right. So that's another factor that I think is very important. After product market fit, after you've really tried out a bunch of products, found the right product, which is the hardest bit, you can then, on a much easier thing to test is a lot of different pieces of content about that product to hopefully get those outliers. If you don't know where to start, this is actually from my content presentation. So check it out. Again, I'm kind of borrowing slides from some of the previous videos I had from here and there. I have a pretty long video just going about content, but I talk about if I'm stuck, right, kind of the themes for a classic Shopify e-commerce D2C brand to think about in terms of what content they can create, right? And I actually created this initially for email marketing because we're very big on email marketing as well. But this actually applies to pretty much any content that you want to create. It might be organic, it might be really geared towards paid, it might be geared towards affiliate or influencer. There's many different things. So just quickly going through them, you can actually data gather from your existing customers. This assumes you actually have an email list again, or even to new customers where you ask them a question, right? And you'd be surprised, this can be very effective, right? Again, if you ask someone a question, then, and again, this obviously needs to be tied to your niche and to your product, right? So think about your niche and then think about what questions that are engaging you can ask potential customers. You can comment on current events, right? Again, for every niche, there's certain days of the year or holidays that obviously match much better to that product or niche. So you can create content around that. You can make something provocative. You always need to be careful with that. You can obviously try to make something funny out of that niche. You can gamify, also very powerful. I think actually not applied as often as it can be or should be, where you can essentially create a game. We sometimes do this for email campaigns where it might be even a small game, right? If it's a quiz or some sort of guessing game where they need to guess what a given image means, and then there's a prize at the end, things like that, right? That can be an interesting genre to play around with. And then, of course, also informative/interesting. You can present some sort of data, some sort of research on that topic, right? And really, this applies to almost any niche, right? Even if your niche is, even if you're just in the coffee niche, right? You can do something provocative there. You can do something funny there. You can ask your customers a question about which way they prefer to brew their coffee. You can, I'm sure there's like some international barista day that you can write about, right? Or make a video about. You can present them studies about how healthy coffee is or isn't, and go a bit more towards the kind of research medical side, right? So those are some genres to just get your thoughts brewing, no pun intended here, to then essentially build a engagement and true fans of the store. Now, in that content presentation, I go in quite a bit of detail. I then talk about 6 levers from actually a book called Influence by Robert Cialdini. It's a pretty famous book, where I then essentially talk about a lot, and here I'm going to be very short, that you can combine those genres and those topics that you want to create content about with levers such as reciprocity, scarcity, social proof, authority, consistency, and liking. So anyway, check it out. I go into detail there, but I think those are very powerful combinations, right? Where you can gamify a data gathering type of piece of content that you combine with social proof, right? And there's ways to do it. And I think if you think about all those different combinations, you might come up with very new and fresh ideas to create content for your store. Finally, content distribution. Again, I have actually a few different videos on that. And again, this is just the way we do it, and there's many other ways to do it. For email, for example, we distribute our content through Klaviyo to existing customers, to new customers. If we have a list of new customers for whatever reason, we use Gmail. Those are 2 powerful tools to automate your email outreach. Again, not going into too much detail here. Check out the video if you want the full breakdown. For affiliates, we use a Shopify app called GoF Pro. And for organic posting, we use a tool called Loomly. We actually use other tools now, where essentially it allows you, if you have one piece of content in a certain dimension, you can post it straight away organically on Facebook, on TikTok, on Instagram, on Pinterest, on LinkedIn, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it just allows you to schedule and automate the posting of organic content and distribute it, one piece of content that you've already created at scale, and do so in a very systematic and methodical way by scheduling it ahead of advance and essentially being very organized and structured with your content, which is also important. So again, to kind of summarize on the content side, you have the potential to create, once you have a great product market fit, to create as much content as you possibly can, given the time and energy that you humanly have, which is amazing because the more you do that, the higher your chance of creating a viral piece of content. If you're stuck with creating new pieces of content, think about the themes that I presented and combine them with the levers that I also presented in the previous slide. Finally, once you have the content, think about how to be as structured and organized as possible to then push that content out into the world at scale, and obviously also contextualize it across different platforms, right? So obviously keep in mind, and I think many people have talked about this, so I don't want to repeat this too much. Obviously, the content that you create for Instagram is going to be different than the content you create for LinkedIn. Obviously, some platforms are geared more towards some brands, so be thoughtful of that. But the point is that you want to work on both quantity and quality. I think you can first start with quantity, figure it out, create this conveyor belt of content and really have it working for you, and then really come back and think about quality of content to then really get the virality going. Okay, so we talked about product market fit and content quality. Now let's talk about targeting. Again, going back to the initial slide, I'm tying everything back to this. So talking about targeting, again, I have drawn out the way targeting correlates with the potential revenue of your store. And I think here it's a relatively straight line. However, there are diminishing returns eventually. What does that mean? That if you show your content about the right product to the right people, the more and more refined your targeting gets, the higher your revenue, but only up to a certain point, right? Because eventually you're going to exhaust the target audience for that niche, for that product. And if you keep on pushing your marketing dollars, and this is really evident with paid marketing channels like Facebook and Google, TikTok, etc., that if you keep on spending more money, and those platforms are happily going to take your money, but you will see that your ROAS is going to eventually drop if you keep on pushing your ad to less and less relevant groups of audiences, right? What obviously those platforms do, right? Like the Facebook Pixel, and also obviously every of those big platforms, they collect as much data as they can about your customer to gear your ads to the right customers, right? So if you spend, once that data is there, right? Once you spend some money, they show your ad to the most relevant customers for you to again maximize the conversion value of your ad channels. However, if you keep on pushing that and you push the envelope in terms of marketing spend, eventually they just need to show it to a broader audience, which won't be as excited and as relevant for your niche and your product, and your ROAS will eventually drop, right? So keep that in mind. But I think what's important to understand here, and this is a bit of a more macro point, but I do want to make it, is that there is obviously places to be in terms of getting attention for your e-commerce store. And this changes over time, right? So I'm going to kind of say something that everyone knows, but I think it's important to keep in mind, which is that right now we have a huge shift towards more short form pieces of content. I mean, as of now, when I'm recording this video, there's a huge shift going on to TikTok, to YouTube Shorts, to Instagram Reels coming back in some shape or form. And generally, we've already had a big shift to TikTok in the last couple of years. But the point that this is really where we are right now, and this is where that tension is shifting in the last couple of years. Before that, really in the 2010s, the place to really kill when you had an e-commerce store was Facebook and Instagram. Right? Like the people who ran ads aggressively in like 2012 on Instagram and Facebook for a good e-commerce store completely killed it, right? Because there was this arbitrage in terms of attention where it was still not saturated enough in terms of ads, but those channels already had enough scale where if you essentially had decent, again, going back to my previous factors, if you had decent content and a good product market fit, and you essentially ran essentially used your marketing dollars on those platforms at that point in time, you managed to achieve abnormal kind of scale and really get abnormal attention to then get traffic to your website extremely, extremely cheaply. Before that, another decade before that, it was really email and Google Ads. I'm maybe a bit too young for this, but I keep on hearing that if you send emails in the early 2000s or in the late 1990s, the open rates were something like 70, 80%. I don't know to what extent that's true, but I can totally imagine it because it was obviously a novel technology back then. And now everyone's just tired of getting spam on their emails and they just close it for the most part, right? So email marketing, and I have a separate video on that as well. You need to obviously really add value there and to build an audience. But before, you could just send some random email and people would be excited just because they were so fascinated by opening emails. I think Google Ads, even now, Google is obviously still massive in terms of their Google Ads and YouTube Ads on that point. But I think the peak was again in the early 2000s where you just have those stories where if people ran Google Ads for the e-commerce store in the early 2000s, they were able to again get this abnormal attention for each dollar that they paid to their store, which was just, again, where in that brief moment in time, this huge opportunity, which again cycled off, right? Again, it doesn't mean that all those channels aren't here anymore. It just means that they're not at the peak, at the climax of their performance as they used to be right when they were novel. And again, when the demand supply dynamics were the most attractive. And then just going back, before you obviously had television ads, you still have brands that I think live on because they really killed it and they really kind of boiled it into our brains in the 90s, right? I'm thinking about like some brands in the kind of house appliance cleaning niche that, they just had all those television ads, which really kind of stuck, I think, with that generation. So that was really the time for television ads to crush. And the brands who did it back then were the ones who kind of really killed it. Before that, you had radio ads, and before that, you even had newspaper ads. I think you get the point that in any almost, kind of time period, you had certain amounts, those are just some examples, right? You had certain channels where you could target to find your customers, where again, the demand supply dynamics were such where the opportunity was the biggest, right? And this opportunity never sticks forever because the more people realize that there's an opportunity, the more it gets flooded and the more those abnormal profits get spread out, right? To use economic terms, and it turns a bit more into a perfect competition where then you need to just provide way more, right? Or you just get less for the same dollar that you spent, right? It doesn't mean that you can't be effective, right? We still are very heavy on email ads and Google ads, and we have a good ROAS for some of our stores on those channels, even though they're not at their peak, right? They're still useful. We even did a television ad, which didn't work at all, by the way, but we did do that. Definitely, there's still opportunities everywhere. But the point is, where is the attention now, and where should you focus? That's really what you should think about in terms of targeting. And the big question is, what's next, right? So it's just a matter of time until there is the new shift. And if you can be in the beginning of that new shift, that's where you can really reap the biggest benefits for your e-commerce store, right? but you need to have set up the first two factors, right? You need to have found that product market fit. You need to have great content, which you've already tested and seen which content might have the potential to become viral. And then you need to target and show that content to the right people, the right channels, which fits the demand, supply, and kind of that tension arbitrage of the time on that given channel. And finally, website conversion funnel. This is the last factor, if you remember going back to the first slide. And here, I actually, again, have separate videos on this where I essentially make the point, and I think this is an interesting point, which I kind of learned the hard way, is that your website needs to be decent enough, but after this threshold of marginal return, right, where you have a good enough website, every additional improvement you make comes with very heavy diminishing returns in terms of higher revenue or higher financial performance, generally speaking. And I really want to reiterate that. If you have a good enough website, don't spend too much time tweaking out the last 5-10% and making everything perfect. I'm telling you, there's stores, I see it every day, making tens of millions, hundreds of millions in revenue with websites that are, again, they're good looking websites, but they're nothing special, right? You can create them on a free Shopify theme, right? And obviously you need to make sure they look decent and the color coding is fine and all those things. But after that, the marginal returns are extremely, extremely hard, and it's just not worth your time, right? I would rather take this time and invest it and go back in terms of finding new products, create new and better content, and figure out the targeting. Generally, that's where your energy and time is better spent, in my opinion. And I also learned the hard way with one of the first stores I created. I spent way too much time on the website and made it look extremely beautiful, but that really didn't lead to much beyond just it being pleasing to the eye. But that's because I screwed up on the product market fit and on the content and on the other factors that I mentioned. However, of course, this doesn't mean that your website should look like absolute crap. If your website looks like it was made in 1997, right, you will be on the slower side, where of course your revenue is going to suffer, right? So you need to get it to this kind of marginal return, and I'm telling you this marginal return isn't that high. In a separate video, I literally Google 100 biggest Shopify stores, right? All those stores are making hundreds of millions by definition, them being the biggest ones in the world. And I go on their websites and I just show example after example that the product pages are nothing special, right? That you can create those product pages today, right? It's just really not that special. You don't need to pay some agency. Please don't pay some agency to design a product page for you, right? I'm really bad with color coding and with like fonts, and even there it's manageable. And even if you don't have the prettiest looking website, you can still make a couple of million revenue for sure. So those are the four important factors that you need to essentially start your e-commerce store. And I think this is the end of my presentation. And I'll just summarize that if you have the best product market fit, have a great creative that you show to the right people and then convert it on a decent enough looking website, you will make sales. And hopefully some of the things I mentioned will be useful for you to decide how you approach this, and hopefully save you a lot of time and energy to build your Shopify store. So let me know if this was helpful. And obviously I couldn't go into everything, but given the time, those were the most important points I wanted to mention. Hey, before you bounce, check out some of the Shopify apps that we have built for our own stores, which might be useful for your stores. So we're very excited to hear your feedback, and check it out in the link below.